Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me, or good evening, or whatever it is where you are. I think people are joining from all over the world. Now, it's about time to get started. I know some people are still coming in. If you're wondering where you are, this is the online conference on digital immortality with im in brackets. It looks great in writing. I've no idea how to pronounce that. Digital im stroke mortality, philosophy, ethics, and design. And we'll get started in just a minute. All right, then I think we are quorate. So great to see our panelists. I can't see all the participants, but I see that there are some, so welcome. Now, it's often said that digital technologies are changing every aspect of life, but I think what's equally important, but less often said, is that they're changing every aspect of death. They're changing death practices, for example, the way people are mourned and remembered. They're changing the nature of our legacies, of what we leave behind. These enormous digital clouds that linger like an aura long after our bodies are gone. And some people, of course, as you know, I'm sure, believe that these digital prostheses are really extending our very selves, and that this digital self might hold enough of our identity to allow us to persist into the future, to survive after ordinary biological death. Well, these ideas have long been speculated about. I'm sure we have many fans of science fiction with us today who have enjoyed reading the fantastic, often subtle, philosophically rich explorations of these themes in fiction. But whereas the imaginative speculations have focused very much on the ontological question of survival, of whether our digital avatars are really us, if you like, in reality, our digital afterlives pose a much wider range of questions. And in this little conference today, we want to place this ontological question of survival alongside some of the many other questions that our digital selves pose for us, the legal questions and ethical questions, the design challenges and artistic responses, and so on. So it's a very interdisciplinary gathering that we have today, because of course these questions cut across disciplinary boundaries. It's almost a cliche that AI and other digital technologies challenge what it means to be human. But on this topic, I think that claim has real resonance, as nothing defines humans so much as our limited lifespans, our mortality, our awareness of our mortality, what we do with that awareness, how we respond to it. And we're very lucky to have three fantastic panels today, each full of leading figures who are going to help us explore these questions of digital mortality and immortality. So I'll introduce the speakers in detail ahead of each of those panels. The three panels you've probably seen: first, law and ethics; second, philosophy; and third, design. I'm personally very excited to be hosting this event. I should introduce myself. My name's Stephen Cave. I have a long-standing interest in questions of mortality. My book, Immortality, came out in 2012, and then was looking ahead to some of the ways in which technology was reframing these ancient questions of life and death. But since then, I spent most of my time as director of the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence here at the University of Cambridge, where we look very broadly at the ethics and impact of AI and related technologies. So this event today is bringing together my two main interests, AI and digital on the one hand, and questions of mortality and immortality and philosophy of death on the other. Now, I also want to introduce Katarzyna Nowacek-Basinska. Katarzyna, or Kasia, is a final year PhD student at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland and a visiting scholar at my center in Cambridge. And she leads the grant Immortality Technocultural Strategies of Contemporary Times, funded by the Polish National Science Center. And as the panelists will know very well, Kasia is the real brains behind today's event. She's the one who did all the work in putting together these fantastic panels that we have today. So thank you, Kasia, and she will be chairing the third panel. And I'd also like to thank Nick Devlin and Tony Leach from my team who are supporting this event behind the scenes, making sure things run smoothly, I hope, touch wood. So before we kick off, which we will do in just a minute, a few practical matters. So each panel consists of 3 presentations, and we'll hear all of those presentations before we take questions. But hopefully you can see a Q&A function in the Zoom. So you don't have to try to remember your questions you wanted to put to the first speakers all the way until after the third speaker spoken. You can put questions in the Q&A at any time, and please do. And when I'm moderating, I'll read them out, or Kasia will when she's moderating, and put them to the panelists. There is also a chat function, and please, participants, do use the chat function to discuss with each other. I won't be looking to the chat function for questions to the panelists. If you have a question for the panelists, please put it in Q&A, but do use the chat function to chat with each other, to record your thoughts and comments. And perhaps now, if you could write in the chat function who you are, maybe a bit about where you come from, what discipline or your affiliation, or something about your interest in this topic. So we have a sense of who it is out there that we are speaking to. So please do that now. That would be really helpful for us. And as I say, use that also to engage with each other. So I think that's enough preliminaries, that we can move ahead to our first panel, which is on the law and ethics of digital immortality. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Birnhack, who's Professor of Law at the Tel Aviv University, who researches, teaches and writes about intellectual property and privacy law and information law. Law and technology, of course, hugely relevant to what we're discussing today. And joining Michael is Tal Morse. Tal Morse completed his PhD at the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE, London School of Economics. And he teaches at the Department of Photographic Communication at the Hadassah Academic College in Jerusalem. And also on this panel, we have Edina Harbinja, who is a senior lecturer in media and privacy law. Her principal areas of research and teaching are related to the legal issues around the internet and emerging technologies. And Karl Uhrmann. Karl is an associate senior lecturer at the Department of Government, who did his PhD in Oxford with Luciano Floridi, because we know Luciano well, and I remember the work that the two of you produced on this topic that was very influential for my thinking on the growing digital afterlife industry. So those are our panelists, and as I say, I'm going to ask each of them to speak in turn, and then save your questions, put them in the Q&A, and we should have plenty of time for discussion. Each of the panelists is going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll start digitally harassing them if they exceed that by too much. So first of all, over to Tal and Michael. So Tal and Michael, you're still on mute. I don't know if something we need to change or you can change. Are you having any luck?
We are okay. Yes. Sorry about that. The mute unmute is the new and now of the file version of the digital world. So we are delighted to join you from Tel Aviv, and we will be discussing one aspect of digital remains, and that is the privacy aspects thereof. And our discussion frames this topic within what we call the privacy paradox. This is part of a broader project in which we are looking into the legal, theoretical, and practical issues of the law, the social norms, and the technologies of this topic. We are doing so by quantitative research, qualitative research, and of course, theoretical elements. So let's begin with the fundamentals, the building blocks of our discussion. And first is the privacy paradox. The privacy paradox has been identified in the literature regarding living people's privacy issues. And that paradox, not the best term on earth, but this is the term that is used in the literature, is the gap between what users say they want regarding privacy and what they actually do or do not do. And the literature has observed a gap in this regard. People say they are very much interested in privacy, but their behavior suggests otherwise. And there are some explanations brought up in the literature for that. And later on, we shall ask if these explanations are relevant to the posthumous condition. So one explanation is, well, there is no paradox. People do understand what's going on. Yes, they are interested in privacy, but they are willing to give it up in exchange, a trade-off with whatever benefit they receive from the application provider or service provider, etc. Another kind of explanation is information deficiency. People do not understand what's going on. And a third and related explanation is various cognitive biases. Even if we do understand what's going on, we are unable to assess the gravity or the implications of giving up our information. The privacy paradox literature has also differentiated between social privacy, that is between one person and another person, and institutional privacy, that is the relationship between people and the service providers such as Facebook, Google, etc. So this is the privacy paradox regarding the living. And now we move to the posthumous condition, and the question is, does the privacy paradox persist after death? In other words, is there a gap between what people want regarding their privacy after they die and the way they behave during their lives? So this is what we are trying to explore, and we are doing so by quantitative research, and Tal will present this part.
Hi, sorry for my voice. I lost my voice this morning. So in order to assess the posthumous privacy paradox, we conducted a national survey in Israel, in which we asked people about their thoughts of managing digital remains. And in the analysis, we looked into the preferences, as the literature of privacy paradox suggests. And we asked people, would you like that someone will have access to your account on the following platforms after you die? We looked into email services, social networks, and cloud storage services. And as the findings show, there is a mixed approach here. Some people, something between 45 and 50% of the people, they wish to grant access to their accounts after they die. Something like a third of the population wish to deny all access to their accounts, and something like 20% of the population, they have a mixed approach. They want to choose which information to give access to, and to which person to give access to this information. Now, we asked about these three kinds of platforms, but when we combine the analysis to see if people have the same approach on all three platforms, we get this combined analysis of the findings, which indicates that these approaches are not across the board. Some people want to leave access to their email accounts, but they don't want to leave access to their social networks, and vice versa. So when we look at the combined approach to the three platforms, we see that 38% of the people want to leave access to all platforms. 27% of the people say that they want to deny access to all the platforms, and 35% have their mixed approaches. saying that they want to control which platform will be accessible to which person and which content on each platform will be accessible to each person. So this is the preference part of the study. And since the privacy paradox is interested in the gap between preferences and behavior, we also looked at behavior. Now, before we dive into the data on behavior, we need to say something about the possibilities of managing digital remains posthumously. Currently, there are services that allow people to manage access to their digital remains. If we look at Facebook, this is the legacy contact tool. If we look at Google and their services and their platforms, this is the inactive account management. And in order to proceed with the analysis, we asked people if they have heard about these services, and if yes, if they have activated them. Now, our findings show that only 18% of the population in Israel back in 2017, only 18% of the people of the population was aware of these possibilities, and of these people, only a third of them, meaning that only 6% of the sample, have indicated that they have activated these services. Now, these findings suggest that people do not use the online tools, and this finding is also was also found in other studies in other countries as well. So what does it mean accessing digital remains if people do not manage access to their digital remains? We call this informal access. We can make this analogy of having access to the physical objects that people leave behind. And in this sense, once people have access to the devices, to the computer, to the iPhone, to the tablet, and if these devices store the passwords, then the person that has access to the device has access to the content that it holds. So we asked people, in case you cannot access the internet, who else other than you can access your online accounts and use them? And these are the answers that we received for this question. And again, we made an analysis of the approaches across platforms, and we get this picture of 26% of the people that reply that they have informal access on all three platforms. 29% said that they have denied access, or they block access to their they do not allow informal access on all three platforms, and 45% of the sample are in a state of partial informal access. So is there a paradox here? Again, the privacy paradox is about the juxtaposition between preferences and behavior. And in order to give answer to the question about the posthumous privacy paradox, we cross-tabulated the preferences and behavior. And this gives us basically three options. Option one is that there is no paradox, that people behave in the same way that they express wishes. So if people want to deny access to all their accounts, and indeed there is no informal access, there is no paradox. And the same goes for the other option. If people want to share everything and all their accounts are informally accessible, then there is no paradox. There is also the option of the traditional or the classical privacy paradox, that people say that they want privacy, but their behavior suggests otherwise. So these are the combinations that allow the posthumous, that suggest the posthumous privacy paradox, that people want to keep their information inaccessible, but their behavior suggests that it will be accessible after they die. And we also found an inverted privacy paradox. This is another option, yet that is not discussed in the literature yet, and we point to it. The inverted privacy paradox is a situation in which people want to keep their privacy in their lives, but want to allow access to their personal information after they die. And in this case, people need to be to behave in a way that will allow access to their information. Now, the inverted paradox is that people who wish to share information with others after they die behave in a way that blocks access to information after they die. So this is the inverted paradox, and we looked at all these combinations and analyzed our data accordingly. And what we see here is this following picture. We see that the largest segment of the sample is situated in the inverted posthumous privacy paradox, meaning that they will wish to allow access to their digital remains. However, their current behavior suggests that this information would not be accessible. 26% are situated in the posthumous privacy paradox, the classical privacy paradox, and 14% are in mixed preference, have a mix of preferences and behavior. So this requires further analysis. And 22% of the population are not in a position of paradox, because there is no gap between their preferences and their behavior. This means that for most of the people, there will be some kind of posthumous privacy paradox. There's going to be a mismatch between their wishes of granting access to their digital remains and their actual behavior online.
So what does all of this mean? So our main finding is that, yes, the posthumous privacy paradox does exist, and there's a mismatch, as Karl has just said, between preferences and actual behavior regarding what will happen with one's personal data after they die. And we have also found the inverted privacy paradox, and it will be interesting to see whether such a paradox exists also for the living, going back in the other direction. Another issue that has come up in this discussion is the continuity, and in some cases discontinuity, between people's wishes during their life and death. Someone may be very private during their life, but yet about the posthumous condition, they will say, well, everything should be open, or vice versa. We have been conducting interviews and researching focus groups, and we have seen this discontinuity in both directions come up in those discussions as well. And so there are quite a few questions for further research. Some of us we are undertaking ourselves, but we invite everybody, of course, to join this. One big question is why? Why does this posthumous privacy paradox take place? So maybe the living explanations, or the explanations for the living's privacy paradox apply here as well. Informational gaps, cognitive biases, etc. Here, especially, we believe that thinking of death as a taboo. This is something that many people avoid discussing, avoid talking about, avoid thinking of as much as they can. Maybe that plays a crucial role in not managing posthumous digital remains, what will become digital remains. The terror management theory may also be a possible explanation here. Other dimensions to this study, maybe this is a uniquely Israeli situation. We doubt it. We believe that it does apply in other countries, but we need to see, of course, empirical studies in other countries. And does it persist over time? Maybe as people learn more and feel more comfortable in doing whatever digital action they do, maybe this will change in one way or the other. Maybe the posthumous management services will improve and be more common and maybe cheaper and more available. So maybe that will change as well. Of course, there are numerous policy implications. First and foremost, as a lawyer, should the law interfere? Given the variety of preferences and the variety of behaviors and the complexity of this, can the law interfere? If so, if the answer is yes, that the law should interfere and can interfere, the question is how? Setting a default rule, which seems to be kind of a magic solution, will defy a large segment of the population's preferences, whatever the default is. So that is a major question here, which should be aligned with a theoretical discussion of the essence or the legal essence of digital remains. In a related study, we differentiate between property, such as bitcoins, information about property, such as information about bank accounts, copyright or other IP-related remains, and finally, personal data. In that case, yet another complex question arises, and that is, does privacy survive death, which is a major theoretical and legal question. So these are two of the publications related to the study that we have published online and our contacts. And we are very much looking forward to hear our colleagues on this panel and, of course, the discussion later on. So thank you so much for bearing with us.
Well, thank you, Tal and Michael. That was incredibly interesting, and like all the best research, answers one question and opens up at least 10 more. But thank you also for a perfect presentation, incredibly clear and exactly on time. So let's set the standard for the rest of the day. No pressure to the other panelists. Can I just say thank you to those participants who have already introduced themselves on the chat. Please do keep it coming. It's made clear to me what an incredibly interesting group of people we have tuning in. I so much wish it could be in person, but next time. Anyway, please do, as I say, engage on the chat and the Q&A. And next up, we have Edina. Edina, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'll share my slides just shortly. Okay, I hope you can see them and hear me.
Yes, very good.
Thank you. So I will I think my talk really follows on very well on Michael and Tal's. So that was an excellent order, I think. So of course, I am aware of Michael and Tal's work and this research in particular, and it will serve as a blueprint for our quantitative research, where we will investigate similar questions and build on what they've said significantly about postmortem privacy paradox and the inverted postmortem privacy paradox, because as part of the Leverhulme Trust funded project that I am a part of the team, we are conducting empirical research on postmortem privacy in the UK as well. So we've just completed the qualitative part where we discussed with stakeholders such as lawyers, civil society, and the tech companies. And our next phase of research is quantitative inquiry, similar to what Michael and Tal have done, and we'll be looking for a postdoc actually. So if anyone here is interested in joining the team, we'll be looking for a social scientist or humanities research who has skills in quantitative research. So please watch out for the advert soon. So what I'm going to talk about is not this upcoming research, of course, or not the qualitative part of our project that we finished, because we are still coding our interviews and trying to come up with themes and ideas there. So we're in the analysis part of it. I'm going to talk about something that I have been thinking about for a few years now, and that builds on my earlier research on postmortem privacy, which is a slightly different concept of postmortal privacy that ties in really well with this conference theme of immortality. So in other words, very, very crudely summarized, privacy of postmortal humans or immortal humans, and what that means for law. Well, this for law, of course, means science fiction, because, as you know, law is very much a traditional discipline and is behind a lot of technological developments, is trying to catch up all the time, which is something that we all are aware of. But a chapter of this around postmortem privacy and immortality was also published in Maggie Savin-Baden's book on digital afterlife, that someone mentioned in the chat, as well as also being a part of the book. So you can already take a look if you would like to hear more about this particular research. But I'm now going to just summarize a few points that I think are important for our discussion here. And again, I apologize that some of this might be very law focused, but I will try to make it also theoretically and conceptually appealing to other disciplines as well. So I have been researching digital assets and postmortem privacy, digital legacy from a legal perspective for now 10 years, which for me is a long time, for someone else might not be that long. And what I think still stands here is that we are, especially in the legal and social legal research, we still encounter and we still deal with quite inadequate conceptualizations or non-existent conceptualizations in some legal texts as well, when we talk about digital legacy or digital remains or digital assets or alternatively digital immortal self. So all of these are concepts that some of you have investigated through the lenses of your own disciplines, but in law we have tried to define some of that in my and other colleagues' work, but legal texts, meaning statutes and the case law, have largely remained either confusing or very patchy, and in some jurisdictions non-existent when it comes to these digital remains. So postmortem privacy is something that I have been interested in since the start of my PhD, and in those early years of my PhD with Professor Lillian Edwards and my PhD supervisor, we defined this concept as the right of a person to preserve and control what becomes of his or her reputation, dignity, integrity, secrets, or memory after that. So quite a broad conception and definition that would encompass, in legal terms, dignity protected by defamation, secrets or memory potentially protected by privacy or data protection, integrity, autonomy protected by testamentary freedom in some form, etc. So we try to encompass all of these different legal institutions, but also theoretical concepts. And then a more narrow definition that we have focused some of our research on was the protection of privacy, informational privacy in particular, and personal data of deceased users. And this is the area that has developed quite a lot, quite significantly in the past years and since GDPR, and I'll mention that a little bit shortly. And then in my further work, then as a next step, I made closer links between this broad definition of postmortem privacy and testamentary freedom in particular, as an extension of one's autonomy post-mortem, recognized in the law for a very long time now. And then, of course, post-mortem extension of personality and the control, consequently the control of highly personal digital assets, as we call them. So personal digital assets, if we can call them assets, maybe that's not the right term either, but as lawyers we refer to a lot of concepts and values themselves as assets, I think often wrongly. So when we talk about highly personal digital assets, we mean those that are representing aspects of our identities, our personal data, our image in technology and online, everything that constitutes our informational body. And I'll mention it now. Professor Luciano Floridi has discussed, and Karl, of course, as his colleague and the PhD student. So just to sketch briefly approaches to regulating digital legacy. So going back to digital legacy as a concept, everything that remains, including digital assets that may be property, as Michael and Tal mentioned, but also aspects of identity and the self that remain online. Different legal systems have adopted over the past decade or so, or a bit more, different approaches to this, such as a very property-focused approach, succession regime, digital wills, as in Canada, Catalonia in Germany with the Facebook case that you've probably heard of, 2018, where the federal court confirmed that succession applies to social media, in that the heirs step into the shoes of the deceased in the same way they step into their shoes for any other contract, so contract with Facebook or any other property item. And then similar quasi-property regime as seen in Estonia or Italy, so similar to the succession of copyright and intellectual property, a limited amount of time for a post-mortem that protects digital legacy and, as I said, very similar to copyright with property focus again. And then post-mortem privacy regime, talking about implicitly, not very explicitly, in those laws such as Digital Republics Act or RUFADA in the US, the model law adopted by the Federal Law Commission, where postmortem privacy comes out quite strongly in principles, but it's not obviously is not defined in the text as such, but protections that are available to individuals, and recognitions of some of the digital legacy management tools, such as Inactive Account Manager, Facebook Legacy Contact, and now Apple Legacy Contact, and others have been recognized by those laws. So quite protective, I would say, of this concept of postmortem privacy that I've mentioned before. Or, of course, no response, or as we call it, data freedom in England and Wales as a separate jurisdictions, in that property and succession is very different within the UK, with Scotland having a mixed legal system in those areas, and England and Wales a very common law, of course, common law approach. So there is no response in case law or statutes, unfortunately, and there are some law reforms, ongoing law reforms that aim to reform the law of wills, but are still considering digital assets and their transmission as a very complex area that we are not ready to legislate yet. But this might change now after the pandemics and the pace that these questions have been dealt with and surfaced increasingly in the public discourse, but also the legislative and the policy discussions. So moving on from those, and now very brief sketches that I've admittedly provided due to the lack of time. What I thought more recently, or very recently in my research, is that what we define as digital legacy or digital remains or postmortem privacy or digital assets might not encompass some of the aspects of, and now going to the theme of immortality, some of the aspects of immortality of the postmortal self, or the remains that will be present after death in different forms and mediated and curated through technology and increasingly complex technologies, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. So in the chapter I wrote for the Digital Afterlife book, I called this concept of postmortal privacy, that protects informational body as defined by Professor Luciano Floridi, and further in the work with Karl and Professor Floridi and their paper on the postmortem digital industry and the exploitation of this postmortem informational body through those different business models. So postmortem privacy would aim to protect that informational body as conceived by Professor Floridi. All the remains and all the memes and all the memories and data that constitute the body in the digital sphere, and that is expressed, stored, and mediated and curated through technology, and adopts a form of immortality, as again borrowed from the sociological and philosophical conceptions from Jacobsen's book on digital on postmortal society, and in particular Brown's conception of immortality, explained and put forward in his chapter in this book on immortality by proxy, the survival of the memes. So the survival of the memories, the survival of the data, and the survival of the identity that is ours as we see it. So what counts to us as ours is the self that Brown sees as surviving the death of the physical body. So I thought that this conceptually could perhaps explain better the emerging aspects of immortality that we're seeing, and examples that I will look into shortly. So that is the graph that shows the conception of postmortem privacy that underpinned by privacy, dignity, autonomy, integrity, and protecting informational body, postmortem privacy as a narrower concept, and immortality by proxy, as I've just discussed. So an example of some of these protects, or an example where we could see postmortem privacy in practice, or protecting aspects of immortality could be seen in recent or less recent emergence of different chatbots, fiancés creating as chatbots, Black Mirror-esque Be Right Back services and attempts in California, but also elsewhere, and of course deepfakes that might not be as sophisticated, but are still representing the deceased in a more sophisticated way than perhaps some previous models and technologies have been able to. So for law, this would be very much undefined and unregulated in most parts of the world, as I will shortly show. But of course, this is also very ethically complex and problematic, and this is what I leave, of course, to colleagues working in philosophy and ethics and other disciplines to uncover. And I know that a lot of them have engaged in doing so. But for us, lawyers, the decision of how to regulate deepfakes is highly complex, because there are so many competing interests and issues here, including, for example, copyright, privacy, the right to publicity, succession rights, the right to access, the law of wills, contracts, and access to data, etc. So all of this intertwined quite interestingly on the example of deepfakes and chatbots as maybe a better and even better and more obvious example. So once again, in this example, we see key tensions in this area of the digital legacy and remains. So again, the tensions between the deceased autonomy. Does the deceased want to be deepfake and chatbotted on death? What about their agency and autonomy here that might compete with the agency and wishes of their surviving family members, but more for law, heirs, the next of kin, personal representatives, executors, etc. And then again, privacy surfaces as one of the key issues here, because the deceased might be represented here quite in a quite vivid and a way that represents them quite truthfully. So of course, the question of mortality and the deceased approach and the deceased wishes and perceptions of mortality again versus the surviving stakeholders perceptions of mortality as well is an interesting tension to explore when we talk about all of these services. And there is one that has just been announced or publicized, I think yesterday or the day before, called Hereafter. If you haven't come across, I suggest you do. And again, it's a service that allows a person to record their life story, and that will be then processed by an AI, quite a simple machine learning agent that will then be able to interact and present the story or answer the questions that the surviving family members might have on death of that person. So a chatbot of a sort, but quite a simple and rudimentary one, and that is there. But you might have also heard of My Heritage, the photo that I've just showed in my cover slide, and the images that were shared flooded Twitter at some point when the service became popular, where deepfake images of the deceased relatives were created through that service. So just looking at the law around these deepfakes, again in England, there's no protection of privacy, so we cannot say of privacy on death. So we couldn't argue that these services and deepfakes or chatbots would violate postmortem privacy. There's no violation of European Court of Human Rights and Article 8, the right to privacy, either, because it doesn't extend directly to the deceased. It does extend to the infringements of privacy of their surviving family members in certain cases, but not the deceased themselves. Potentially, where we could see some a legal provision that applies to these is when a person shares the photograph and does not own a copyright in that photograph, and the photograph was commissioned privately by the deceased. Section 85 of Computer Designs and Patents Act would apply here as a potential remedy. But if heirs, like in the case of My Heritage, what was the most common case, if they share this image to create a deepfake or a chatbot, then because they inherit, if they inherit copyright, they would not be violating this law. And interestingly, just briefly looking at the EU AI regulations that some of you might have heard of, the proposal for EU AI regs, that's quite in a lot of academic circles, so a very, very important question and the topic for research. There is an obligation, transparency obligation for certain AI systems that include deepfakes. So AI system that generates or manipulates image and video content that appreciably resembles existing persons, places, or other entities, and would falsely appeal to a person to be authentic or truthful. And it says deepfake. So existing persons, again, are deceased included in this or not? That is one question. But then another question is does this go far enough that just the mere requirement for transparency? So again, opens more questions and really just gently sort of regulates some forms of deepfakes. And I will have to wrap up shortly, but I will just mention briefly New York deepfake law from last year that was introduced, and where the right to publicity is extended. The right to publicity is an American property-based concept of 40 years post-mortem, and where the digital replicas of deceased performance have been prohibited if there is no consent. And you can see here what the definition is of this digital replica. So that is so realistic that a reasonable observer would believe it is a performance by an individual being portrayed and no other individual. So again, we can criticize and unpick this definition further. So finally, what are the ways forward to try in law and think about and regulate or not, if we don't think it's necessary, this increasingly complex area with not just assets and legacy, but also, as I said, aspects of immortality and the self, however we would like to call it. And my suggestion is to abandon property paradigm for these purely personal aspects and these purely personal aspects of immortality. And an idea, so for example, would be to recognize the do not deep fake me clause in a will that could be enforceable. And I discussed this in more detail in my upcoming book that will be published with the Edinburgh University Press next year, and Digital Death, Digital Assets and Postmortem Privacy, and also with Professor Lillian Edwards and Dr. Marissa McQuay, a more specific article that talks about deepfakes and chatbots to be published in mid-2020 by the Computer Law Computer Law and Policy Review. So that was my talk, very very briefly and summarized. And if you would like to follow the project, I've just shown some Twitter handles here, and thank you for your attention, and sorry to not to be on time as Michael and Tal. Apologies for running over a little bit. Thank you,
Edina. And that was really interesting. And often we philosophers are criticized for obsessing about definitions and being told we worry too much about semantics and so on. And I always think, you think us philosophers are bad, you ought to meet my lawyer friends. But I think what you made clear is how important these definitional questions are, how deeply entwined they are with the ethical questions, with the ontological questions. And I think you also made clear just what enormous gaps there are, but both in the current laws in different jurisdictions and, of course, current norms. It's not like we have a consensus on how to approach these issues. Next up, Karl, you've already been cited a couple of times. Let's hear from the man himself. Karl, over to you.
Yes, I only realized now that for some reason I need to renew Zoom's permission to share my screen. So if you just wait and bear with me a second.
Do we need to do anything at our end, or does it seem to be working?
We'll see. I think it works now, hopefully.
Yeah, looks good.
There we go. Perfect. You can see everything, right? And it's the full screen. Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. I'll try to keep to below the 15-20 minutes. So my name is Karl. I completed my PhD at the University of Oxford, the Oxford Internet Institute, with Luciano Floridi just last year. And I'm now leading a project at Uppsala University on AI and political communication, which will last for 5 years, funded by the Wallenberg Foundation. But what I'll present here is a brief summary of the central argument of my doctoral thesis. which is now being turned into a monograph book, hopefully to be published at some point during 2022, possibly late or early 2023. And the title of the thesis, as well as the book, is The Postmortal Condition, Being with the Dead in the Age of Digital Media. So today I'm just going to present some insights from the thesis that I think will be interesting for you all. So I begin the argument of my thesis not in the digital revolution, but in a completely different revolution, namely 15,000 years ago, when humans stopped being nomads. So at the very end of the Paleolithic. So up until then, when someone dies, well, you basically just bury them in the sand and you keep on going. But when you stop being a nomad, that strategy ceases to work because the dead will inevitably be there for you if you have a permanent settlement. So all of a sudden, humans were faced with the question, what do we do with the dead now that we cannot just leave them behind? So one of the earliest practices that started emerging was that people buried the dead within their houses or underneath their houses. But curiously, they kept the skulls and made new faces for the dead out of plaster and added seashells as eyes. And they actually kept these decorated skulls within their houses so that the living and the dead would literally be sharing the same dwelling. And I'm using this to us very curious cultural practice to make a parallel to what's going on today. Because as you know, we're now living in a society where we're exiting the modern way of dealing with death and the dead, which is kind of analog to the nomads' way of just walking away from the dead. But rather than walking away, we have been putting them outside of our dwellings. Cemeteries are outside of the city. The archives are something that we can enter, but then again, leave. So during the modern age, we haven't lived with the dead. But as you know, this is all changing now because what we're leaving behind is no longer just a body or a pile of bones, but really a corpus of information. What we leave behind is increasingly data. And as I'm sure most of the people watching this presentation knows, this data can be used to replicate our personality, to create chatbots or deepfakes that Edina were talking about. We see this in fiction. We see this also increasingly in real life with various startups that are trying to create chatbots that replicate the personality of the dead. So in a very similar fashion to how the early Neolithic settlers, the first people that were not nomads, had to ask, well, what now? What do we do with the dead? We're posed with a question of, what should I do with the dead person's data? Should I preserve it, or is it instead imperative to destroy it? Should I maybe archive it for future generations and so on? And these are complex ethical questions that we're all facing now and then as individuals. The argument of my thesis and subsequently of my book is that we're entering into a new mode of being with the dead that I call the postmortal condition, a play with the postmodern condition for those who are familiar with postmodern theory. So what I'm referring to here is not digital immortality per se. It's not the immortality of the mind of the person who died, but it's rather a termination of this hiding of the dead that dominates modernity, through which is emerging a new mode of being with the deceased, where they remain constantly present within our immediate sphere of moral consideration, forcing us to reconsider the question, what should we do with the dead? And the final argument of the thesis is that this new question requires a dislocation of the living as the center of moral discourse. This is a question that ultimately concerns both future and past and present generations. So whenever we answer the question of what should we do with the dead, we cannot only focus on our interests as living members of society. So that, in very brief, is the argument that I'm posing in this thesis and the book. But I would like to focus on one particular aspect in this presentation today, which is that we're not asking this question of what should we do with the dead merely as individuals. You know, I'm not just asking what should I do with my dead grandfather's Facebook account, but we're also asking this question as a generation. There are currently 5.17 billion internet users in 2021, and it's rapidly increasing. And many of those are about to die. Only within the next 3 decades, 2.2 billion people will die, many of whom will leave a considerable amount of data behind. If we look at this graph, for instance, which is the mortality, expected mortalities of the 21st century, we can see that towards the end of the century, we're going to approach 8 billion dead people, which is essentially 1 billion people per decade. So when we're asking what should we do with the data of the dead, we're also asking this as a generation, asking how to take care of and be the custodians of the data of the past generation. I want to just highlight one specific example that I think is kind of illuminating for what this means in practice for internet platforms, which is a study that I did in 2019 with my colleague David Watson, also a member of the Digital Ethics Lab in Oxford, where we looked at the expected mortality rate and matched this with Facebook age data. So this graph here depicts the death or the expected amount of dead Facebook users during the 21st century. And as you can see, towards the end of the century, we would approach approximately 1.4 billion dead profiles. This is assuming that no new users joined the network as of 2019, which is a highly unlikely scenario because Facebook is still growing approximately with 13% per year. So if they would maintain this current growth until they saturate all markets, of course, we are rather looking at a graph where towards the end of the century, they're gathering close to 5 billion dead profiles on Facebook alone, and disregarding all other networks and search data and stuff that you leave behind on the web. Will the dead actually surpass the living? Well, in this first scenario, we expect that in the late 2060s, there will actually be more dead than alive users on the network. If they continue growing, however, we would rather be looking at somewhere in the beginning of the 22nd century. But what I'm trying to say with this is basically that when we talk about digital afterlife, we're not just talking about an individual phenomenon, but we're talking about a collective phenomenon and a macro level phenomenon. A central part of my argument is that the data that we accumulate on social networks and the search data that we leave behind is when we can consider it collectively, it really is our digital world heritage. After all, the data that we collectively leave behind is the biggest archive of human behavior ever assembled in the history of our species. Any previous archive, any previous library is dwarfed when compared to the archives of Google or Facebook, which are essentially becoming perfect imprints of our time. So I'm quoting Varando here. in saying that social networking accounts may be the principal and eventually only source for future generations to learn about their predecessors. So when we talk about the ethics of digital remains, we're not only talking about the ethical aspects of dead people's rights, but we're also talking about future generations, the rights of future generations to know their past. Now, speaking of immortality, I emphasize in my book that there is really no such thing as digital immortality. It's quite the opposite, actually. I'm quoting Jeff Rothenberg, a prominent digital preservationist, who's saying that digital information lasts forever or 5 years, whichever comes first, which is a kind of good rule of thumb, because we tend to think of digital information as something that just exists out there in some abstract ether. But digital information, of course, exists on servers, and servers take resources to maintain, and they take a lot of manpower to keep curating and stewarding data. So when we're preserving the data of a dead person, we're always doing so at a cost, meaning that there's a very big heritage, unless there are some serious financial incentives for Facebook and Google to preserve it, will be gone within a matter of 2 or 3 decades, at the very least, or at the very most. But it's not only a risk of losing access to our digital heritage because of the failing financial incentives to keep them. We're also looking at a quite serious political situation, in that in 15, 20 years' time, the digital remains that are harbored by Facebook and Google will essentially be history. So we're allocating, or we're outsourcing the management of digital history to a handful of corporations who will more or less monopolize what is possible to know about our recent past. So in the book and in the article that I cited on Facebook that David Watson and I did, we're quoting George Orwell's 1984, where one of the party members says, "We, the party, control all records and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not?" And in fiction, we often see, the evil party or the state that seizes control of history and all archives and what is possible to know about the past. But in reality, we're rather looking at a corporate dominance of the past and a corporate dominance of our collective digital remains, which, unless we actively do something about it, is just going to accumulate power. So, how do we do this? How do we solve these issues? I'm afraid I cannot give any straight up answers. I'm better at posing problems than providing answers for them. But the direction in which I think the solutions must lie is that currently the only principle that we're using to evaluate whether a dead person's data is worth preserving is, can we make money on it? Can Facebook or Google continue making money on this data? If the answer is no, well, the incentive is always to delete. If the answer is yes, well, then some really morally dubious questions arise as to how do you actually make profit from dead people's data. My contention is that in most cases, the answer is no. It does not break even to accumulate billions of dead people's data unless you have a really good financial incentive to do so. But we're currently allocating this question solely to the market. We're letting only the market decide whose data is worth preserving and in what format. The argument of the book is that we should allow for a plurality of values to guide our selection of data that we leave behind for the next generation, basically trying to limit the corporate dominance of our collective digital past. And that was the end of my presentation at 15.5 minutes sharp. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Karl. That was incredibly rich, and I think a really nice segue to the next panel, which will be on the philosophical issues. So to make clear how entwined they are. And I'm grateful to you for broadening our perspective on the ethical and legal questions to the collective from the individual. Thank you all for finishing on time. It means we've got half an hour for discussion for this panel. Please, panelists, feel free to put questions to each other while questions come in from the audience. We have one very straightforward question, Karl, which is it possible to read your doctoral thesis? Now, if I remember rightly, you said it's going to come out as a book.
It is going to come out as a book. It's the manuscript is pretty much finished, but apparently the publishing industry works very slowly. But yes, you can. If you just search for my name in Google Scholar, you will find it. I think it's my most recent publication. You could also just go on to Solo, the Oxford Library Service, and search for the postmortal condition, being with the dead in the age of digital media. Should warn you that it's an integrated thesis, so it's just the first two and the final chapters that are elaborating on this postmortal condition argument that I presented here in the beginning of the presentation. The rest of it is, or the chapters are a collection of articles that I've published throughout my PhD.
Great, thank you. Kasia.
So yeah, thank you for all your great presentations, super inspiring and thought-provoking. And my question relates to the idea of the global ethical legal approach to digital immortality or postmortal condition, or whatever we would like to call it, and whether it contradicts your findings or maybe not. Because I think it's a quite ambivalent issue, because on the one hand, obviously we should looking for protective mechanisms, maybe on the global level. But on the other hand, I think what we should bear in mind here is what's underneath the surface. I mean, what's underneath this narrative. Because when we discuss global ethical approach to digital immortality, we assume that there is something like a transcultural project of digital immortality, that we can create a universal product or service that can be easily disseminated around the world. So I'm raising this issue because my concern is that what's mostly missing from the account, that digital immortality project has very imperialistic aspirations, which are leveraged up by the capitalist model. So taking advantage from the fact that we are here in such international and intercultural group of experts, I would like to ask you whether you perceive this digital immortality project as a threat to cultural diversity, or to be even more specific, I think I'm asking about the ethics of creating the global ethics of digital immortality. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kasia. Who would like to take that?
We are happy to join, but I think Edina maybe first, if you.
Yeah, I can start, but if you don't mind. So thanks. That's a great question. And for speaking as a lawyer, now very narrowly looking at jurisdictions and the laws and our experiences with regulating technologies so far in different forms, and including GDPR and data protection, for example, including the upcoming laws that aim to regulate platforms and AI in the EU, as opposed to the UK, that is now very different with the online safety approach and AI approach. Of course, America, Australia, Canada, and other countries, not to forget African and Asian countries and their regulatory approaches that are very, very diverse. So now even in Europe, we see extremely diverse approaches to regulating platforms that are essential in our discussion of digital legacy and digital immortality. So I can't see any approximation or harmonization of these laws globally in any near future, if ever, because of course, laws on the other hand are very culturally determined, and in the areas such as succession, property, contracts, even in the EU are completely different and diverse and are not harmonized at the EU level, as opposed to, for example, copyright that is harmonized, and as opposed to GDPR and privacy that is data protection that is more harmonized. And where I can see these imperialistic influences, if you want, is in the data protection regime, where the Brussels effect and adoption of similar statutes around the world that we now begin to see some post-mortem privacy protections in African countries that are based on some of the national laws in the EU that protect rights of the deceased, data rights of the deceased to an extent, and GDPR has created a mess there because it has given member states the power to legislate. But we can see influences coming in certain areas of law. But more broadly, when we talk about digital legacy, we have to think about, as I said, so many different areas of law that probably can never be, or not in our lifetime, or not in the very near future, ever harmonized or brought together. So maybe that's good news.
Thank you, Edina. Now, Michael, you kindly gave the floor to Edina. Let's hear from you now, and then Karl.
Sure. So I join Edina's comments, and I would just like to, this is how I think about it. Technologies are global. Okay, Facebook is used almost all over the world, with the exception of China and some other few places. So technology is global. Laws are, relatively speaking, local and reflecting local norms and histories, etc., in democratic and in less democratic countries. So there are differences over there in liberal economies and less liberal economies. So there are many differences there. But because the main platforms at stake, meaning Facebook, Google, Twitter, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, right? They are American and they are powerful, and they dictate the terms of the game, or at least the initial terms of the game in their contracts, which nobody reads, right? We do accept, next, okay, okay. And then if someone wishes to challenge that in wherever they are, they have to bring in the local laws, contract laws, and laws that regulate directly or indirectly platforms, etc., etc. And that's where we see divergence. However, I think such divergence is absolutely fine. Maybe it's a cause for celebration, and different cultures may reflect their values and norms in their laws and practices, with internal debates which may change over time, etc. For us scholars, of course, it provides a fantastic global lab to compare different approaches. But for the time being, I think it's okay that we have different approaches around the globe, as long as those who make the decisions are not only the platforms themselves.
Thank you, Michael. And Karl, you raised already the worry of the homogenizing power of the corporates behind these platforms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually the one that highlights power asymmetries and the political economy of digital afterlife. But on this very topic, I would actually like to push back slightly, not maybe so much on the legal matters. I believe that Edina is right in that it's possibly impossible to harmonize all these various legal approaches. But you often hear in panels and even people citing in academic literature saying that, oh, the cultural differences in the approach to death are so vast, and surely that must spill over also on digital remains. Now, I don't know if that is actually true. I've only seen one survey ever on that matter. It was made by Grimm and Sheason in, I think, 2015, possibly 2014, where they're actually looking at various nationalities, various cultures and religions. And what they're finding is essentially very small differences, or surprisingly small differences, at least, in terms of the preferences for the fate of digital remains. So I think that at least there's a possibility, or we should consider the possibility, that religions and scriptures give us a lot of answers in terms of how to deal with the biological remains of a dead person and how burial should take place and so on. But the Bible or the Quran, or whatever text you're using, leave no instructions as to what to do with a person's Facebook profile. So I think it's possible that what we're approaching here is an entirely new phenomenon, that we don't have the cultural or religious tools to properly unpack it. So it's possible that this is an opportunity to forge a new culture that may actually possibly be global, that we may share values in terms of the status of digital remains. Now, as I said, I've only seen one survey on this. I'd be happy to see more evidence, but the only evidence that I have seen points in the direction that cultural differences are not that big.
Well, that's incredibly interesting. Thank you. And brings us to the question that Angelo put in the Q&A on whether religious beliefs influence the participants' choice to share their information after death. And that was a question Angelo put while Tal and Michael were presenting. Tal and Michael, I mean, have you looked into the demographic differences behind your data?
Yeah, so actually, I'm happy to share with you that we just completed another survey just this week, in which we also looked into demographics and approaches to death, and approaches to digital technologies, and to the possibilities of transferring into the afterlives. And in these in this new survey, we do see that the cultural background or religion plays a role in the approaches people have towards digital remains and towards the finality of life. And this also impacts the way they think about managing access to digital remains. So, for instance, this is very initial findings. We didn't delve into them so far. We do see that, for example, in Israel, the Muslim community is less likely to agree to share their digital remains with their peers or with their family after they die. And the Jewish community in Israel is more likely to share that information. The Muslim community is more likely to deny access to digital remains, and vice versa. So these are very initial findings that we have, that we still need to look into them and to unpack them. But it does suggest that there is kind of a cultural component to the way people understand the end of life, and to the way people wish to engage with the dead posthumously or digitally.
Yeah, can I just respond to that real quick? Yeah, so just to clarify, my argument is not that culture or religion doesn't matter at all. My argument is merely that in panel discussions like this, my contention is that people tend to overemphasize how important they are. We often hear that, oh, but the differences are vast, they can never be bridged. It's so different. And I don't know, what your results are, but at least from the study that I shared here, of course, there is a difference. but it's not a huge difference. It's not monumental. And within a couple of decades, I'm pretty sure that it can and probably will be bridged.
I mean, it might be that the opposite is the case, because at the moment it doesn't seem as much difference because people haven't thought about it very much. And as religions and other belief systems come to take a view, that actually these views then diverge.
It's a very good point.
And I wonder if also, has anyone noted any differences between age groups? Tal or Michael, was that something you looked at? Do the digital natives have a different approach to people like me who grew up without the internet?
I didn't look into the recent data that we have. In the previous study that we did, and this is a study that we presented here, we didn't find any significant differences between age groups. There were some differences, and also our assumption before doing the analysis was that younger people will be less troubled by questions of end of life and after death, and to the contrary, that older people will have less content, less data that they will leave, and therefore this will play a role in the way that they wish to manage the access to their digital remains. But as far as I recall, these differences were not statistically significant, and therefore we didn't, at most times we didn't find them relevant to report. We did another aspect that we didn't put into this presentation today. We did ask people about managing access to their data on dating applications. Now, this is something that younger generations use more often than older people. However, the findings that we had were not, we didn't have enough replies for these questions, so we are not, we omitted these parts from the analysis, but this is something that we should bear in mind, that younger people have more data, more diverse data, sometimes more controversial data, and this also plays a role in the way that they should think about managing access to their personal information, whether they're here or not.
Interesting. And of course, at the moment, we have this quite significant digital divide between generations, those who grew up with the technologies, those who didn't. That will disappear at some point. And then it will become perhaps clearer whether this is a generational, whether there are generational divides versus age divides. That is, maybe people tend to change their views as they get older, regardless of whether they come from what generation. Now, Karl, you brought into the conversation the idea that of the public good, and that we might want to be preserving data and making it available whether people wish it or not, or you put on the table this conflict between individual interests and collective interests. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about what you think should be done about that, and to hear the panelists' responses.
Yeah, I mean, it's an obvious conflict of interests. Future generations would obviously have an interest in gaining access to the data archives that we're accumulating now. Meanwhile, the dead have an interest in privacy, and the living have an interest in not spending too much resources on preserving data. And then we also have, of course, the corporations, the industry. They have their interests, which is mainly to make profit, of course, but also to honor their agreements with their users. Actually, my most recent paper, which is going to come out sometime in the spring, is on this very topic, where I'm doing or making a policy proposal as to how this can be managed on a global level. And my argument is that the situation resembles in many respects the situation with World Heritage sites. So take the pyramids, for instance. We can all agree that the pyramids are culturally relevant, not only to current Egyptians, but basically to all of humanity, because it tells us something about our common ancestry and so on. It tells us something about what it is to be human. Nevertheless, UNESCO cannot just walk into Egypt and be like, oh, you know what? There's a cosmopolitan value to these sites. They're ours now. Because we still have to respect national sovereignty. In a similar sense, we need to respect the sovereignty of corporations like Facebook or Google. The solution in the case of digital or of physical World Heritage is the UNESCO World Heritage label. So the nation that harbors whatever site we're talking about, such as the pyramids, would agree not to destroy the heritage, would pledge to preserve it to the best of their ability, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, UNESCO will provide the relevant expertise to actually preserve it in a proper manner. So they will routinely send resources and experts on preservation. Well, we could imagine something similar with digital heritage, that we say to use Facebook as an example. Okay, you can keep your data and let it be proprietary, but pledge not to destroy it. And we will send digital preservation experts that will help you go through the data, that will help you preserve it for long-time preservation, that will help you with cheaper storage and to maintain the integrity of that data. So of course, I don't know the practicalities of how such a proposal would be realized, but I think that is the kind of compromises that we should be looking for going forward.
That's a really interesting idea. I find it hard to imagine that my Facebook post would be of great value to posterity, but
well, not your individually, maybe, but collectively, tens of thousands of people, or millions or billions of people will be interesting.
No, you're right. It is, of course, a huge resource, and I think you were right to point out in your presentation that we can't take for granted that it will be around forever, although it's so often talked about in those terms. But for those of us who have been around long enough and to see many changes in format, and now VHS videos are no longer playable, that we know this information isn't forever unless serious work is done to preserve the material underpinnings. Other panelists, I'd be interested in your thoughts on Karl's proposal.
So I'll just, I am sort of a little bit concerned as to how far this should go. And of course, Karl did say that the practicalities and the methods of preservation and what the decisions that the experts would make might need to be developed. But I am still not so much as a lawyer in this case, but conceptually this tension between remembrance and forgetting, and to what extent are we allowed to forget? And just because we have this biggest archive in the history of humankind in social networks, should we, just because we can, if we can, preserve it, and for how long in the future? And do we use any test as a lawyer now? Speaking as a lawyer with lawyers' head, any form of public interest test there to determine whether our Facebook, Twitter, other profiles are in the public interest to be preserved, are in the interest of history, or do we want to completely change the paradigm of history and just preserve everything that we can because we can? And there of course comes as in law the question for me another question would be between preserving and then violating autonomy and privacy and honoring the wishes of those who might not have wanted to be remembered, unless they're famous writers or philosophers or people in the public interest, or just regular individuals and their wishes, and to what extent the interests of history and preservation would prevail there? And these are more questions than answers. I don't have the answers.
But so interesting. I mean, now we go to Pompeii, for example, and enjoy the graffiti on the walls from 2,000 years ago. Do the people who put that graffiti there have a right to be forgotten? Did they want it? Is that how they wanted to be remembered? If they signed it, should it be anonymized, or will we think ill of them? Well, we think it doesn't matter because it's 2,000 years ago, and people might think that about our wishes to be anonymous 2,000 years from now. Michael, Tal, any thoughts?
Just to also add the angle that you just mentioned, we often talk about the right to be forgotten, but the right to be forgotten in legal terms is the right for delinking. It's not the right to be deleted from the internet. And yes, some people might wish to be forgotten, to actually disappear from the net after they die. There is it's not exactly identical, but there is this case of Kafka's writings. He left his request to discard all of his writings and never to publish them. Yet his manager did not follow that request, and now we can enjoy his writings. But his specific request was to disappear, was to not to be remembered. So there are some ethical questions about fulfilling the wishes of people after they die, and this also adds to this complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now we have just a couple of minutes for this panel. Oh, Kasia, you have a question.
Yes, so I'm wondering how to reconcile the promise of eternity, of this eternal preservation, with relatively short term business models. So I mean, social media and other platforms didn't sign up to be eternal guardians for their users. So what if Facebook or other platforms close or fail? What to do with those data? And how to respond to this problem?
Yeah, that's a great point, Karl. Your proposal assumed, in the way you put it, that these companies will still exist, and that we might encourage them, incentivize them to do something for the public good. But of course, these are very new companies that might disappear as quickly as they came.
Yeah, actually, last year, a colleague of mine from Oxford and I published a paper in Internet Policy Review with the title, "What if Facebook Goes Down?" Where we do a legal and ethical analysis of that very scenario. We all know that Facebook harbors close to 3 billion user profiles, and those are the main assets of the company. And of course, in the case of bankruptcy, what happens with the assets is that they're sold out to the highest bidder. Now, the GDPR has some protections of under what circumstances that can be done, but for the vast majority of users, it's just up for grabs for the highest bidder. So you're certainly right in that the integrity of these vast archives may very well come into question in the case of bankruptcy, which is why in the study that I mentioned with the proposal of a digital World Heritage label, that would be part of the label, that the data cannot be split up or sold in the case of bankruptcy, but must always be protected, and the historical value must always be protected in the case of bankruptcy, such as, if a country faces bankruptcy or war or whatever, they cannot threaten it would be illegal for them to destroy or in other ways corrupt the World Heritage sites within their domains.
Great, very, very helpful. Thank you. Michael and Tal, some final thoughts.
So just a quick point, Facebook was not initiated in order to maintain this posthumous communication. However, there are services that were initially established in order to facilitate that. And studies show that these companies, they do not survive. These companies that promise us to keep our data forever, for eternity, they often shut down within less than a decade. So this is another thing to keep in mind. And just to say that thank you so much for hosting us and for having this insightful discussion.
Well, thank you all. We're out of time for this panel, but thank you, Michael and Tal and Edina and Karl, for these really interesting thoughts and bringing some clarity and some structure and some practical proposals to a really new area of research, plus plenty of unanswered questions for the students in the audience wondering what to write their theses on. And some nice segues to the next panel, which is in half an hour, on the philosophy of digital immortality with Maggie Savin-Barden and Patrick Stokes and Davide Sisto. So we will keep this Zoom link open, won't we? I think, yes, Kash is nodding. And it's lunch break here in the UK, but I know we've had people from all over the world. Thanks for joining us so far, and see you in half an hour. That's 1 p.m. GMT. And just please join me again in virtually thanking our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We'll see you soon.
See you in half an hour.